So let's start with some background. A principle that's often invoked in transportation policy is user pays, user benefits. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the user pays principle. It's been the kind of the bedrock of transportation finance, at least surface transportation finance in the United States since the 1950s, and it offers several advantages, 5 advantages over just sort of typical tax and spending. One is fairness. So highway users who are paying a user tax or user fee, they are paying into a system that then builds out the network that benefits them. It's proportional to use, so users who drive more pay more. Those who don't drive at all don't pay anything. It's self-limiting if set up properly because you can only spend as much money as you bring in. It's predictable because travel behavior, apart from some major shocks like COVID-19, generally doesn't fluctuate very wildly in the short run. So what you're bringing in year over year is pretty similar. And finally, it signals investment. So where you're generating that revenue and how much you're bringing in tells you how much you should reinvest into the system for improvements.
And then are there particular mistakes that federal, state, local governments tend to make with regards to user pay, user benefits?
Well, I think you can sort of quibble over mostly on the benefits principle side of things, and that's where you get into things like diversions, which I know we'll touch on in a bit. But often I think the biggest problem that we've seen with or facing the user pays, user benefits principle is people just don't take it all that seriously, and it's gradually eroded over time until you're left with something that really doesn't resemble the user pays principle anymore, and you're then foregoing those benefits of user pays.
So you're referencing the 1950s and user pays, user benefits. So the sort of lodestone of surface transportation policy is the Highway Trust Fund. Can you explain sort of the when, whys, and whos of how that got started?
Yeah, so the Highway Trust Fund, that was the creation of that coincided with the creation of the interstate highway system that was under President Eisenhower in 1956. And President Eisenhower actually originally, he was intent on building out this network, nationwide network of superhighways that had been in the planning stages for about 2 decades prior. But he was initially supportive of using tolls, and then he was convinced by his crack team at the Bureau of Public Roads that wasn't the best way to proceed, and we can argue about whether that was a mistake or not. But ultimately what they agreed to was a system that is based largely on fuel tax revenue. It's about 85–90% each year of Highway Trust Fund revenue comes from taxes on gasoline and diesel, and then that would pay out on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the way it was set up was very much in keeping with the user pays principle, and at the time in the 1950s, following World War II, there was a lot of concern over the national debt. So Congress and the White House were very intent on avoiding that kind of deficit spending.
And just to put in perspective how long the system's been in place, 1956 is before Joe Biden was elected to the Senate. So who owns and operates the National Highway Network?
So by and large, it's state-owned and operated. There's a few exceptions on federal lands and national parks where the federal government directly administers that, the Federal Highway Administration on behalf of the Park Service or whatever. But by and large, these are state-owned assets. They are operated by state departments of transportation. And that going even before the Highway Trust Fund and the interstate highway system, the early federal aid highway acts, when you were talking about farm to market roads in the kind of World War I era, those were also owned by the states. So it was never the federal government is big on spending money. It's not big on operating these assets.
So the Eisenhower plan was to build the national network coast to coast, border to border. That project wrapped up a while ago, but we're spending increasingly large amounts still on the Highway Trust Fund. Why is that?
Well, yeah, so the interstate highway system, that was the whole reason behind creating the Highway Trust Fund. That was functionally complete in the 1980s. It's about 99, if you look at planned route mileage, it's about 99% complete. A lot of people back then assumed that the federal government would, put up a banner, mission accomplished, the interstate system's done. We can get rid of the fuel tax, but obviously that didn't happen. So you saw in 1991 the first post-interstate surface transportation law, the highway bill, was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, and that I think is really the focal point in sort of the beginning of modern surface transportation policy, and I think a lot of the problems we're now facing today.
So those of you who are cursed like me to occasionally dip your toe into the realm of left-wing transportation Twitter, you'll often see the claim that the Federal Highway Fund should be devoting a larger portion of its spending towards mass transit. What the heck does mass transit have to do with the Highway Fund in the first place?
Well, it has to do with the Highway Fund because of some political horse trading in the early 1980s, early in the first term of President Reagan, because of increasing fuel efficiency following the energy crisis, increasing fuel efficiency in the vehicle fleet, and then just sort of general materials inflation. The White House was seeking a 5-cent increase in the fuel tax. So from back then it was 4 cents. They wanted to increase it to 9 cents. But they faced opposition from urban Democrats who opposed increasing the fuel tax on equity grounds. Very different situation that we find ourselves today. But in exchange for that 5-cent increase, what they got was one of those cents, of those 5, was dedicated for the new mass transit account within the Highway Trust Fund. So that began the sort of the formal dedication of Highway Trust Fund dollars to mass transit. But even before that, in the 1970s, Congress had made some tweaks that allowed more urbanized states to redirect their highway account funding toward mass transit projects, and that's because beginning in the 1960s, you saw a transit in crisis, and it's remained in crisis ever since.
And then are there any other sort of riders on the Highway Fund that don't pay into it?
Right, yeah, so I mean, with ICE-T, I mentioned that's when we started seeing a lot of these kind of permanent diversion programs. So within the highway account, there are a number of spending programs, more than half a dozen. And we're now at the point, coming off of the latest, which is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which included a 5-year surface transportation authorization. We're now at the point where about 55% of highway accounts, so not even talking about the mass transit account, but 55% of highway trust fund dollars are dedicated to highways. So about 45% either are or can be diverted depending on the particular choices of either the U.S. Department of Transportation or state departments of transportation.
So as they've been piling on all these diversions, what has that done to the trust fund solvency?
Well, the trust fund has been sort of functionally insolvent since 2008, and solvency of the highway trust fund. So it's a bit of accounting fiction. It's these dollars are credited to this, but it's not a lockbox or anything like that. But there are procedures when the amount credited, the balance of the trust fund drops below a certain amount. Cash management procedures at the Department of Transportation kick in, which basically means they start delaying reimbursements to the states, which obviously the states don't like that. So rather than try to rationalize spending and revenue, Congress since 2008 has been bailing out the trust fund. And through the current law, so this will take us to through September 2026, Congress has authorized $275 billion in highway trust fund bailouts. So basically, since 2008, we have spent or are on track to spend under current law $275 billion more than was brought in. So that is sort of the if there's one number to know, that's kind of the state of the user pays principle at the federal level right now.
So moving away from funding of the highways for a minute, what's sort of the need? We've made this big investment in the highway system. What is it going to take to just keep things going?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually somewhat interesting because we saw this big plus up under IIJA, everyone talking about all this new money for infrastructure, but it was incredibly poorly targeted. And the elephant in the room is the future of the interstate highway system. So much of the system is nearing the end of its service life. These kind of highway projects have about 50 years in them before you need to completely reconstruct them from the substructure up, so from the dirt up. And we're at that point now, and we will be, more and more of the system over the next 2 decades will be reaching that point. So over the next 2 decades, we have at least, just on the interstate highway system, which, to put in context, the interstate highway system is 2.6% of lane miles, of roadway lane miles in the United States. Over $1 trillion in needs just to rebuild what we have today, to bring it back to a state of good repair and up to modern standards, so no capacity increases, just to re-deliver what we already have. Over $1 trillion in needs, and no one, Congress has not figured out a way to pay for any of that.
So we are still at a point where the gas tax is the primary notional funder of the trust fund. What does the future hold for that funding stream as the vehicle fleet moves increasingly towards hybrids and EVs?
Yeah, that's a for a system that's based on revenue from motor fuel. If you stop using motor fuel to power your vehicles, that's a major problem. And that's not just a problem for the federal government. I mean, the states. So the federal government, they play a major role in surface transportation funding, but states spend 3 to 4 times as much on those networks. So the system is primarily state funded, even though the federal government does have a large role. So states have their own fuel taxes, and I think. And we're not at the point where we can do this yet, but we're going to need to get off of the per gallon charging method and toward something more like a per mile system. And there's early research going on how you can actually do that. It is being done with our limited toll road systems in the United States. But yeah, if we move off of away from fuel as the source of power for our vehicles, we're going to need a new system.
Interesting interesting debate to be had over that one. I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around is the federal government is spending all this money, even though the states are the ones who are doing the work. At this point, what even is the rationale for federal involvement at all?
The main rationale is that tax collection is very, very cheap. Basically it's, you don't pay the fuel tax at the pump. That's already incorporated in the price of fuel that comes out at the gas station. There are really only there's a few hundred federal fuel taxpayers in the country. It's the bulk distributors. When it comes out of the bulk storage tanks, the rack, that is where the tax is assessed. So because of that, it's very cheap to administer the fuel tax, and that's I think the major reason why states don't want to move toward a more state system, because they view one, given the bailouts, we know that Congress is willing to throw more money at this than they're bringing in, so states view it as a positive, even though I don't. But also, I think the tax administration aspect is an underrated point in this discussion, and it's also moving from per gallon to per mile as the debate on that continues over the next decade or more. That is a major source of controversy on that, just the costs of collection.
And certainly also, mouse travel is one way to try to hypothetically bring it back towards some sort of a user pay, user benefits system. But an alternative that I think might be better is more traditional tolling, which is sort of unevenly used across the country. Why is it that some highways are tolled and others aren't?
Well, this goes back decades before the interstate system was created. In the early days of the federal aid program, so World War I era, that was the tolling ban. So states that were receiving funding from the federal government couldn't use that funding on toll roads, and there's a logic to that. If you're if you're able to raise that money yourself and self-finance the infrastructure, why are you getting this support? But the problem has been is that has made states dependent, or view themselves as dependent on fuel taxes, and in a lot of cases shy away from looking at tolling. Where you do see most of the tolling to date, and it tends to be concentrated on the interstate highway system, about 7% of the interstate system is tolled. It was those highways were tolled prior to the creation of the interstate system. So they built expressways before, and then they were grandfathered in. So anything built before 1960 that was then designated as an interstate segment was grandfathered in. So that's why you see on 95, you will see tolling and toll plazas, whereas most of the rest of the country, you will see decrepit rest areas and no tolling.
In a similar vein, there are different proposals, some enacted, some not, related to congestion pricing, most notably in New York City, but also I live off of 66 in Virginia, and that has congestion pricing. I know when I'm talking to sort of normies about this, and they say, oh my God, I saw a toll that was $30, I want to lynch somebody. What's sort of your perspective on those sorts of pricing?
Yeah, so there's congestion pricing is it's a term that's misused a lot, and I would say and there's a few approaches to it too. So I-66, that's dynamic pricing. So the pricing there, it's based on the actual congestion level. It's about a 15-minute delay. But that is, I guess, the purest form of congestion pricing, because that price, there's no cap, and that's what makes 66 so unique. There's no cap, so that price will rise as high as need be to maintain the average speeds. in that corridor. And that's really, I think, if you're going to do congestion pricing right, we see a lot of things branded as congestion pricing when it's really just variable tolling, because often they're subject to a cap. So you'll then reach that cap, that maximum price, but then it's not deterring people from using the roadway at that time, so you're still getting congestion. And I think that's, in New York City's cordon pricing scheme, I think that's going to be its biggest problem, and I think perhaps do a setback for congestion pricing overall, because people are going to associate that with congestion pricing. But I think the main problem is during times of peak congestion, the price is going to be too low, and then during off-peak hours, it's going to be too high. And I think that's there's a Goldilocks kind of aspect to this that is often missing in the discussion, certainly when it's actually implemented at the infrastructure level.
So again, going back to the swamp, there are parts of there are some highways near where I live in Northern Virginia where there are parallel tolled and non-tolled roads, and the tolled portions are, I believe, owned and operated by a private company. Seems like all we ever talk about is government-owned and operated infrastructure. Are these sorts of private highways, at all prevalent in the U.S., and if not, are they prevalent elsewhere?
Yeah, we're in the United States. We're kind of late to the game on this. There was actually the concept of public-private partnership concessions for toll facilities was actually pioneered in the United States, but then really taken up in Europe, where you see a lot more of those types of facilities, and then you've since seen a lot of growth in that market in Asia and Latin America. The United States, the market's much smaller, or at least the proportion of the overall system under public-private partnership P3 management is much smaller. But where you see it, you do see some toll roads where all lanes are tolled by these P3 concessionaires, but mostly what you're seeing is those adjacent lanes, the managed lanes that are often either high occupancy toll lanes or express toll lanes adjacent to major highways, usually interstates. So that's the market in the U.S. Still quite small, growing. More and more states, especially the fastest growing states, fast growing metropolitan areas, they're seeing more and more congestion, are looking at this, but it's still relatively small compared to our near peer countries in Europe and Asia.
So when we're looking at that mix between the government side and the private side, are there any particular barriers to increasing the amount of private investment so we don't need to have everything on governments?
Yeah, the number one barrier is just the general interstate tolling prohibition. And that's been dialed back a little bit, so you can now toll bridges and tunnels on the interstate. That's legal. But generally speaking, existing interstate lane miles cannot be tolled, and I think that's where you would see the most potential growth, and that's where I think you get the most potential benefit, not only for the congestion mitigation benefits, but also, when these public-private partnership concessions are often set up for tollways as what are known as revenue risk. So the private company takes all the risk associated with construction, with traffic and revenue, with financing, in exchange for collecting that toll revenue for multiple decades. And that, I think, given our fiscal challenges at the federal level, but also at the state level, I think that should be more and more attractive as time goes on. Why not take these major assets not entirely off the books, but largely, functionally off the government's balance sheet?
So we just got done listening to a lengthy discussion about energy policy and the deleterious effects that federal red tape have on development there. Are there federal regulations that affect the cost and timeliness of infrastructure projects?
Yes. So obviously the National Environmental Policy Act has NEPA has all sorts of problems with when it interacts with transportation, just like with energy, or just like when you're trying to build anything of that magnitude. The thing though with highways and the highway, sort of the builders have been quite successful in recent decades of getting categorical exclusions for a lot of highway activities. So perhaps not as severe as energy, at least on the NEPA permitting side. Now, if you want to build a new facility, good luck. Prepare that 3,000-page environmental review. But I think the bigger cost drivers for federal regulation, so Davis-Bacon is a big one. Prevailing wage requirements, basically you've got to pay union scale wages. And then also, and this is a problem that is getting worse under the current administration, the domestic content preferences with Buy America. And I think both of those, and Buy America, I think is particularly obnoxious just because of its explicit tolerance for higher costs.
So one of the, frankly, I think largely unheralded successes of the Free America movement over the last several decades has been creation of right-to-work states. Does Davis-Bacon sort of overwhelm that when it comes to highway construction?
Yeah, if your project costs more than $2,000, you're receiving more than $2,000 in federal funding, you're subject to Davis-Bacon. So regardless of what state labor policy is, now in the states that aren't right to work, they've got mini Davis-Bacon laws. So you're facing a double whammy of prevailing wage. Now, the particular impact of Davis-Bacon, it's generally, it strongly correlates with union density in the state, so, or it's inversely correlated. So if you're a right-to-work state, and you then are facing Davis-Bacon requirements for your highway project, you are at a much bigger disadvantage because you tend to have your union labor is much less prevalent. So the high-cost firm in the state that usually, that basically subsists off of highway contracts, they're getting it. And it's well above the kind of prices that you'd pay for similar projects that aren't receiving federal funding. So it's actually, if you're a right-to-work state, Davis-Bacon most likely hits you harder than if you're a state with high union density.
So one of the talking points that I see most often from the Biden administration, and frankly from President Biden himself, talks a lot about, quote unquote, good-paying jobs coming from federal projects. Am I to understand that construction workers who aren't subject to Davis-Bacon are living hand-to-mouth, living in their cars, or?
No one involved in highway construction is going broke. It's a good gig if you can get it. No, I mean, I think that reflects just a fundamental problem, the way so many politicians look at surface transportation specifically, but public works more broadly. Labor is a cost. That's an input. What we're trying to get out of these assets are productivity benefits, for the people who use them. So we shouldn't be preferencing the people who are building these things, either the people or the materials used to build these things. We should be trying to minimize costs across the board, labor, materials, everything else that goes into these. But I think that often these are viewed as make-work projects, ways to reward certain political constituencies. And I think that's a fundamental problem with political dominance of this type of infrastructure.
One of the things that come to mind for me on that subject is that, frankly, you can't try to legislate your way to having everyone make more than average.